Hello, my name is Rachel Mumaw-Schweser, and I have a complicated relationship with the book of Ephesians because of passages like this one. And there's a lot here that's complicated because it's talking about relationships between people. And relationships can be complicated because, well, people are complicated. So, to ease us into this sometimes contentious passage, let's start with the most relatable part of it. The relationship between enslaved people and their enslavers. But funnily enough, while this may be some of the more uncomfortable verses to read within Scripture, it's actually probably the least contentious part of our passage today, in that we just ignore it as something that's no longer relevant and we move on. But back when this was initially written, the relationship between enslavers and enslaved people that Paul is writing about was the mic drop moment that he was building up to, because slavery was such a significant part of Roman society and had deeply entrenched norms that Paul was trying to break. Now, the institution of slavery in Rome was very different from the institutions of slavery in the United States, mainly in who was enslaved under each system. According to scholars, enslaved people in the Roman Empire were typically war captives, people who were sold or even sold themselves into slavery, and infants abandoned at birth by Roman citizens. This last way of becoming enslaved was actually so well known that this storyline of an enslaved person finding out they are the child of a prominent person seems to have actually been a pretty well-known trope within Roman theater. Because of this, enslaved people came from a wide variety of nationalities and backgrounds, so it was much less race-based than slavery in the United States. But pretty much everything else remained the same. Under Roman law, enslaved people were property, and they could be treated as such. This means that in this passage, Paul is going against the laws and the norms of how enslaved people were treated in ancient Rome. Verses 5 through 8 would have been what the reader of this letter was expecting to hear. Enslaved people should obey with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, something that hopefully sets us a little on edge to hear now. But then they get to verse 9. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. And in one sentence, Paul completely upends the power structure in Roman society. Keep in mind that in Roman culture and thought, enslaved people were property. There were other Roman philosophers at this time arguing for better treatment of enslaved people, but most of them argued that enslavers shouldn't just be too harsh with the people they enslaved. Paul is here telling enslavers to go farther than that. He's telling them to treat enslaved people with the same respect that they expect from them. He's telling them to treat others the way they want to be treated, no matter what their status in society is. And in a society where wealth and where status, where everything, where power over others was meant to be exploited, Paul's statement is radical here. So if Paul is going against the norms of the power dynamics between enslaved people and their enslavers, that might mean he is also going against the norms of the power dynamics between parents and children and husbands and wives. But that's not often how we read this passage, is it? First of all, in my experience, most Christians I've heard talk about this passage don't even talk about the full passage, especially the part about enslaved people. They just focus in on the relationship between husbands and wives, excising it from the surrounding verses and context, and that's the part that has made the entirety of Ephesians such a complicated book for me to read. For the most part, I don't remember my church growing up preaching on this passage on a regular basis, and neither do my parents. I do, however, remember it being cited in Bible studies and in devotionals as one of the passages meant to portray biblical marriage. But I also don't remember my pastors or small group leaders ever explicitly defining what a biblical marriage was in as many words, because they really didn't have to. Instead, they showed what their interpretation of that passage looks like. So kind of like we have gratitude moments here, my church growing up would sometimes bring families forward to talk about their lives and what ministries, volunteer work, or nonprofits they were working for. And for the most part, this was absolutely fantastic. I credit it for instilling in me the importance of serving your community and serving your church, and I think it was one of the things that influenced me into going into ministry. But in pretty much every situation, there was always praise for the husband for what they were doing in the community, and praise for the wife only for her support in what her husband was doing. I don't remember ever seeing it the other way around. And so that was my overwhelming example for what I should aspire to as a woman if I wanted to be married. Because nobody ever used, let's say, Priscilla as an example of the woman I could be. Or Junia, an apostle mentioned in Romans 16. Or Lydia, a businesswoman who was the first European convert to Christianity. Or Phoebe, who was the deacon that carried Paul's letter from him to Rome. Or Joanna, one of the women who financially supported Jesus' ministry. Or Deborah, a judge and a prophetess. Or Huldah, another prophetess. Or Mary Magdalene, who, was the first person to preach the resurrection. Instead, for most of my childhood, I saw women being praised for having a strong relationship and a biblical marriage, with pastors referencing this Ephesians passage when talking to them about their relationships. Except I don't think that's what's being portrayed here in Ephesians, especially once we consider the surrounding verses and the historical, social, and cultural context in which they were written. A lot of how we understand things requires working off of our pre-existing knowledge, which for most of us is our current social and cultural context. We instinctively apply our own context to these verses because, well, what else are we supposed to use as background knowledge besides our own background knowledge, essentially? But if we just apply our cultural context to something without thinking about it, we can sometimes miss something deeper and more beautiful that's happening, or even draw inaccurate conclusions, which I am hoping I am going to be able to demonstrate. I'm going to use the wrong context to describe something, and I want you to see if you can guess what I'm describing. So, in this religion, let's call it, the believers gather in their place of worship once a week. These places can be massive buildings that can hold a few thousands of people. Most buildings hold closer to a few hundred, and some people choose to just worship in their homes, maybe with a few friends. Many people choose to wear special clothing for these services, while others show up in their normal, everyday clothes. Either way, there's often a spirit of belonging and community among the attendees, and in the best places of worship, everyone is welcomed no matter what. There are many different aspects to worship in this religion, and this can vary from sect to sect. There are songs that are traditionally sung, often towards the beginning or end of worship, but music is an important part throughout. There are also ritual chants that are performed, sometimes accompanied by drums or some other instrument. Shouting, crying, and yelling is also not uncommon during these services, and prayers are often spontaneous depending on how the service is going. Another critical part of worship is the food. There are special cuisines that are often prepared to be consumed during worship, and these can take on many different forms, again, often depending on what region we're in. However, things like wings, pizza, and nachos are pretty universal. And depending on how the service goes, people are either elated or despondent at the end of it. A good service is when your team scores more points than the other team, and you have your faith restored in them. And a bad service causes you to potentially lose faith in your team and maybe write one too many comments on social media about blaming the refs for the other team winning the game. So by now you might realize that I'm using a religious context and framework to describe football. Because what other example am I going to use today? This description is quite similar to one I heard in one of my sociology classes, and the point my professor was trying to make is that context is critical when trying to understand something, whether that be sport, a religious practice, or a piece of writing. If we don't consider context, or we apply the wrong context, for example, applying a religious context to a sport, we can draw inaccurate conclusions about the beliefs, culture, societal norms, and the people who lived during that time. So let's go back to our passage and see if we can't get a little more historical context to understand what Paul might be saying here, instead of starting with our own modern-day context. Paul's framework for this entire passage is in 5:21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Everything that follows afterwards, including the relationship between husbands and wives, is his suggestions for how to do that. There are 3 relationships talked about here: husbands and wives, children and parents, and enslaved people and their enslavers. And all 3 of them are laid out in almost identical ways. The first party addressed is the one with the least amount of power in the relationship: wives, children, and enslaved people. In ancient Rome, these people had almost no rights and no protections. Instead, all of the power was in the hands of the husbands and fathers, often called the paterfamilias, or the head of the family. Marriages were often arranged, with the father deciding who his daughter should marry, with no thought as to whether the couple loved or respected each other. And keep in mind that one of the ways that people became slaves was by being abandoned as children by their families. And as far as we can tell, there were no laws against this. So the heads of families could do whatever they wanted with little to no repercussions. Even things like domestic violence, which was illegal, often didn't get prosecuted and instead got swept under the proverbial rug. So the people that Paul addresses first are the people that have almost no power and yet have a ton of expectations for how they act and interact with those who have power over them. Wives are to submit to their husbands, children are to obey their parents, and enslaved people are to obey their enslavers. All of that was expected from this letter, which is probably why Paul addresses them first when talking about each relationship. But then he turns to those with the power and with no expectations on how they're supposed to treat those they have power over. And he gives them commands on how they're supposed to treat people who have less power than they do. He sets expectations that they probably didn't have before. While he can't take away much of the power that society automatically grants them, he can make sure they're not exploiting it. And in that way, he is trying to even out this stark difference in power between the husbands, parents, and enslavers, and the wives, children, and enslaved people. He is calling them into the foremost commandment, part of the foremost commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. I hope you see that there's a reason I had to go so much into Roman culture and social structure to talk about this passage. Not just because I find it fascinating and you are a captive audience that has to listen to me talk about it for about 20 minutes, but because it is important to understanding why Paul would feel compelled to write something like this. For example, Paul's command for husbands to love their wives has a very different meaning when we think about the fact that most marriages were arranged in Roman society. The command for fathers to not exasperate their children and instead raise them in the training and instruction of the Lord looks different when we consider the context that it was legal for those fathers to abandon their children. And most of all, the, at the time, radical command that enslaved people should be treated as people has a very different meaning when you know they were legally considered property under the Roman Empire. My relationship with the book of Ephesians is complicated, not necessarily because of what's written in it, but because of how it was taught to me and shown to me as correct interpretation of these passages. It's a reminder that our actions matter, which is really what Paul is saying here. Paul is expounding on Jesus' message to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. By just reading this passage as a face value list of how to treat people without knowledge of the cultural context behind it, we lose something very precious in this text. We lose that Paul is calling for Christians to not follow the standards of the culture in how they treat people, but instead to follow God's standards to love others as yourself, especially if you have more power, control, wealth, or influence over them. So what will you do when you cross paths with someone whose society has decided is less than everyone else? Someone who is differently abled, someone who's a different race, who's neurodiverse, who doesn't have enough education, who's part of the LGBTQ plus community, who comes from a different country, or someone who is too old or too young to be worth anything according to society. Will you respect them as children of God like yourself and listen and work with them in order towards advancing the kingdom of heaven together? Or will you ignore them? Assume that you know more and are capable of more than them, and miss out on the full beauty and wonder of the kingdom of heaven? Or in short, whose house rules will you follow? Yours? The world's? Or God's?